Hello there, and welcome to the Dull Science. Whether it's tonight or this afternoon or somewhere in that timeless in-between, the hush between ticking clocks, I'm glad you've tuned in. If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. As for me, I'm currently accompanied by the soft rustle of book pages, the occasional sigh of an old desk chair, and a mug of something that began as tea but has become more of a suggestion. So before you drift off, tap like and subscribe if you're into sleepy science. If not, blink twice and we'll forget this ever happened. Let's take a quiet stroll somewhere unexpected. New Caledonia, a slender sliver of land adrift in the southwest Pacific, older than Australia and arguably weirder. Picture a rugged island spine swaddled in thick tropical forest, its roots plunging deep into geological time. These are rocks that once slumbered beneath the ocean floor, crust uplifted by tectonic collision millions of years ago, now weathered into soil that shimmers red, grey and alien. The locals know this land as rich, not just in history or biodiversity, but in metals, not gold or silver, though there's some of that too. No, New Caledonia is famed for something far more peculiar, nickel, and not just in the mines. The soil itself seems saturated with it. So saturated, in fact, that certain trees, native and endemic, meaning they grow nowhere else, have evolved a strange and secret appetite. They drink nickel, quite literally. Their roots draw it in, their trunks circulate it, their leaves wear it, and their sap, should you be so bold as to cut into a branch, glows faintly green, a ghostly hue betraying the presence of metal in liquid form. Let me introduce you to one such tree, Pycnandra acuminata, a member of the Sapotacea family. If you ever visit the sclerophyllous forests in the south of the island, you might spot it standing modestly beside other endemic species, not drawing too much attention, until someone nicks the bark. And then, well, you're treated to a sight worthy of alchemical lore. Pale green sap, thick and slow-moving, almost like enamel paint. That color is the giveaway. It's the nickel, concentrated to a degree that would kill most plants instantly. Not this one. A study led by Anthony van der Ent, an expert in hyperaccumulator ecology, confirmed that Pycnandra acuminata's sap contains up to 25,000 parts per million of nickel. That's 2.5%. To put that in perspective, nickel ore extracted from industrial mining operations often hovers around 1–2%. This tree doesn't just contain nickel, it outperforms mines. Now, why would a tree do this? Why voluntarily imbibe something that's toxic to most of life on Earth? Let's pause there and pan out, because this story is bigger than one curious tree. Over 500 species of plants across at least 50 families have been identified as hyperaccumulators, a term that sounds like a brand of battery, but refers instead to a class of flora that can absorb and store extraordinarily high concentrations of metal in their tissues. Some like nickel, others prefer zinc, cobalt, cadmium, even arsenic. The thresholds for hyperaccumulation vary by element. For nickel, it's over 1,000 parts per million. For zinc, it's 10,000. These plants are incredibly rare, forming only about 0.2% of global species, and yet, they've evolved multiple times, independently, across continents and lineages. That alone hints at something powerful, something survival-worthy, in their strange talent. New Caledonia, in particular, is a botanical treasure chest. Roughly 15% of the world's known nickel hyperaccumulators live there, many still awaiting formal classification. The island's ultramafic soils, born from serpentinized peridotite, offer a naturally high-metal, low-nutrient environment that seems to select for one of two fates, death or metallophilia. And while the trees do appear healthy, this adaptation comes at a cost. They grow slowly, often producing smaller leaves and stunted reproductive structures, but what they lack in speed, they make up for in strategy. Because inside their cells, hidden in vacuoles and bound to organic acids, the nickel doesn't wreak havoc. It's neutralized, sequestered, made livable. It's a bit like building a castle out of landmines and learning to tiptoe perfectly. Back to Pycnandra. The discovery of its metallic sap was not accidental. Van der Ent and colleagues had been systematically surveying the island's flora, following indigenous knowledge and soil surveys. The locals, Kanak communities and nickel prospectors alike had long suspected certain plants indicated metal-rich ground. The practice is called geobotanical prospecting, and it's been used for centuries. In Renaissance Europe, alpine violets were seen as signposts for copper veins. In Soviet Russia, metallophytes were catalogued alongside seismic data. The trees, it turns out, are better geologists than we are. And yet, they are more than signs, they are stories. Living archives of evolutionary experiments in poison handling. Another local marvel is Sebertia acuminata, with similarly vibrant sap and an even more exclusive distribution. It exists only on serpentine rock outcrops, where rainfall is sparse and nutrients scarcer. There, surrounded by metallic soil, this tree grows in small quiet groves, unfazed by its own toxicity. Early researchers joked that you could mine it with a knife, and while that's not entirely practical, the idea isn't far off. Imagine instead of blasting into the earth, we grew our ore. That idea of phytomining will come later in our journey. For now, we're just beginning to grasp the implications, because it's not just the trees that have changed. The whole ecosystem, in response, has had to adjust. Grazing animals avoid hyperaccumulators. Insects veer off or evolve new tricks. Certain butterflies have been observed landing on the leaves, only to recoil mid-nibble. The metallic taste, bitter and alien, is a deterrent. Some speculate that even fungal partners in the soil have evolved to tolerate or mitigate the metal load, though much remains unknown. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's something mesmerizing about the idea of metal in a tree, something that blurs the lines between natural and industrial, biological and mineral. We think of metals as forged in smelters, extracted with dynamite, poured into molds. But here, quietly, over the course of centuries, forests have been performing their own metallurgy, cell by cell, root to leaf, and it's not just aesthetics. These are functioning ecosystems. The metal is part of their biology. Think of it as both sword and shield. It deters pests, confuses pathogens, and intriguingly, may even serve as a form of long-distance communication. Some researchers hypothesize that high-nickel plants emit different volatile compounds, signaling to other flora in metallic dialects we haven't yet deciphered. Whether or not that's true, one thing is clear: these aren't sickly mutants clinging to bad soil, they're champions of adaptation, and they remind us, rather humblingly, that life finds ways to embrace the improbable. So the next time you hold a coin, consider this: somewhere in a New Caledonian forest, a tree may be holding more nickel in its sap than that entire pocketful of change. And it's doing so not out of accident or error, but because over millennia, it learned to drink poison and call it home. And just like that, the forest deepens. Shadows lengthen beneath the canopy. The trees whisper to one another in metallic tones, and beneath our feet, the roots keep working, quietly pulling treasure from stone. If you pressed your ear to the bark of a nickel tree, gently of course, we don't recommend eavesdropping on flora without consent. You wouldn't hear much. No metallic trickling, no industrial humming, just the usual arboreal hush. But inside that quiet frame, something extraordinary is happening at the molecular level. You see, for a plant to tolerate nickel, it must first recognize it, and that's already unusual. Most plant roots treat heavy metals like uninvited guests, barricading entry and sealing the door. But in hyperaccumulators, the door is not only unlocked, it's held open with a polite smile and a chelating handshake. What allows this generosity? Genes, or more precisely, a genetic orchestra playing a very peculiar tune. Let's start underground, at the root interface, where plants encounter all manner of ions: calcium, potassium, magnesium. Those are the usual suspects, but in ultramafic soils, nickel muscles its way in. For normal plants, this influx spells disaster. Nickel can mimic essential nutrients and hijack transporters, jamming the root's internal wiring. But hyperaccumulators have evolved a modified set of metal transporter proteins, molecular doormen, that not only recognize nickel, but usher it in with purpose. In Arabidopsis hulrii, a zinc and cadmium hyperaccumulator, found in parts of Central Europe, scientists identified a gene called heavy metal ATPase4. This gene is duplicated and overexpressed, allowing the plant to efficiently load metal ions into the xylem, the vessel system that carries water and nutrients upward. The result? Smooth transit of metal from root to shoot. Nickel hyperaccumulators have their own versions of this strategy. Studies on Alyssum murale and Alyssum corsicum, nickel lovers native to Balkan serpentine outcrops, show similar upregulation of IRT1-like transporters and NEREMP family proteins, both crucial for controlling metal uptake and intracellular trafficking. These aren't brute force solutions. They're refined, evolutionary rewrites. But let's pause and appreciate the delicacy involved. Once the metal's inside, it needs to be detoxified. Otherwise it will run wild, binding proteins, displacing cofactors, and generally behaving like a chemically confused bull in a cellular china shop. So the plant binds the nickel to organic molecules, citrate, malate, or histidine, forming stable complexes that can be shuttled around without chaos. In the leaves, nickel often accumulates in vacuoles, storage bubbles where the metal is locked away, out of reach from sensitive processes. Think of it as a secure vault, nestled inside a living bank, and it gets stranger. In some hyperaccumulators, entire biochemical pathways are retuned to accommodate their metallic load. A 2021 paper by Kramer et al. In Plant Physiology detailed how hyperaccumulators suppress typical metal stress responses. Normal plants scream when metal arrives. Hyperaccumulators merely raise an eyebrow. There's even evidence for altered expression of ethylene and jasmonic acid signaling, hormonal systems that regulate stress and defense. It's as if these plants have rewritten the script for what counts as danger. But here's the real twist. Many of these changes, from transporter expression to metal sequestration, aren't just hard-coded, they're inducible. The plant doesn't always behave this way. It senses the presence of nickel and responds accordingly, fine-tuning its machinery like an engineer adjusting valves and levers in a vintage engine room. Some researchers have likened this to a botanical immune system, a responsive memory-informed defense network that adapts over time. That's not quite accurate, but the metaphor is comforting. It speaks to the intelligence of adaptation, to the way life bends without breaking. Of course, none of this comes free. Overexpressing transporters consumes energy. Sequestering metal requires organic ligands, which cost carbon. There's metabolic overhead, and hyperaccumulators pay it willingly. Like knights donning heavy armor, they trade agility for survival, and yet they flourish. Not everywhere, not quickly, but enduringly. In soils where other species shrivel, they stand serene, unbothered, if not proud. It makes one wonder what other hidden rewrites exist in nature. What other quiet edits have been scribbled in chloroplast DNA or root epidermis, granting ordinary-looking organisms extraordinary abilities? There's a certain humility to be learned from these plants. They don't shout, they don't tower or dazzle, but at the microscopic level, they're performing feats of biochemical finesse that rival any high-tech lab. Next time you pass a humble weed in gravel, give it a second look. There's always a chance it's doing something magnificent, something that took a few million years of genetic negotiation to perfect. And somewhere in a forest, a nickel tree continues its strange symphony, notes forged not of woodwind or string, but of genes and ions and chloroplast dreams. If I told you there were farmers tending fields of metal-rich plants instead of wheat or corn, you might think I'd wandered too far into folklore. But there are places, real, tangible places, where the soil grows not food but nickel, and rather than harvest grain, these farmers reap metal-laden leaves. This is phytomining, a name that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction novella, but refers to something surprisingly grounded. Instead of blasting rock with dynamite and digging deep into the Earth's crust, phytomining uses plants, living, breathing, green things, to extract metal from the soil, gather it in their tissues, and offer it up like chlorophyll-coated treasure. Let's say you have a patch of ultramafic soil, rich in nickel, but not rich enough to justify traditional mining. You could leave it alone, or you could plant a crop of metal-hungry plants, species that evolved on precisely this kind of harsh terrain, capable of soaking up thousands of micrograms of nickel per gram of dry tissue. Then, after a season of growth, you harvest. You dry the leaves and stems, you incinerate the biomass, and what you're left with, in the ash, is not just soot, but metal, recoverable, usable nickel, concentrated by botanical chemistry. The practice was first proposed seriously in the 1990s, but the roots of the idea go back further. Even in the 1970s, scientists like Renee Cheney were exploring the ability of certain plants to extract and tolerate high levels of metals. At the time, the goal was largely remediation, using plants to clean up contaminated sites. But it wasn't long before someone asked, what if we stopped treating this as cleanup and started treating it as harvest? That shift, from pollution management to metal cultivation, is quietly revolutionary. Phytomining offers a different kind of economy, one that doesn't scar the land with open-pit mines or release clouds of sulfur into the sky. It's slower, yes, more seasonal, but also gentler. And in some parts of the world, particularly where traditional mining is too expensive or environmentally damaging, it offers a promising alternative. Take the case of Alyssum murale and Alyssum corsicum. These wildflowers, native to the Balkan region, have become phytomining's poster children. Their leaves accumulate up to 2% nickel by dry weight. They grow well on degraded lands, require little maintenance, and when planted densely, can extract meaningful amounts of metal over several growing cycles. In Albania, field trials began in earnest in the early 2000s, plots of wildflowers waving in the wind, their bright yellow blossoms hiding a secret economy. The ash from their dried stalks, sometimes called green ore, yields nickel in concentrations comparable to poor-grade mined rock. It's not a miracle solution. It won't replace deep mining tomorrow, but it's a start, and in places like the Philippines, with vast stretches of nickel-rich soil and communities looking for sustainable livelihoods, phytomining is being considered not just as an environmental tool, but as a development strategy. Van der Ent and his colleagues have helped conduct feasibility studies there, showing that under the right conditions, a farmer could grow metal with no more effort than a crop of beans. Of course, phytomining has its limits. The returns are modest. You won't extract kilograms of nickel from a single harvest. It's more of a long game, multiple seasons, careful management, rotational planting, and it requires a commitment to patience, something our resource-hungry world is often short on. But its advantages are hard to ignore. Where mining blasts leave craters, phytomining leaves roots. Where smelters belch smoke, phytomining emits the rustle of leaves. The process can even improve soil health over time, reducing metal concentrations in areas where contamination has made other forms of agriculture impossible. There's a poetry to it. Metal not torn from the earth, but coaxed out by green stems and photosynthesis. No giant machines, just sun, water and a leaf with an unusual taste for nickel. And perhaps the most beautiful part, once harvested and refined, the metal is chemically indistinguishable from that extracted through conventional means. A phytomined coin spins just like any other. A phytomined wire carries the same current. The difference is in the story, how it came to be, and what footprints it left behind. There are challenges, of course. Scaling up remains a hurdle. Not every environment supports hyperaccumulator crops. Local ecology must be considered. And while the practice holds promise, it also requires care, not just in planting and harvesting, but in choosing the right species, in protecting biodiversity, in ensuring that native metallophytes aren't displaced by profit-minded monocultures. Still, the idea is gaining traction. Imagine for a moment a future where metal farming becomes a common part of land restoration, where abandoned mines are planted with greenery, not just to cover the scars, but to harvest what's left behind, where former tailing heaps, those toxic piles of mining waste, become fields of chrome-kissed leaves, humming quietly in the breeze. In that future, a hillside might yield enough nickel for a fleet of solar batteries. A grove of saplings might power an entire village. Not immediately, not extravagantly, but steadily, gently, like rainfall filling a barrel, and we will have the plants to thank. Their stubbornness, their elegance, their centuries of genetic tinkering that made them not just survivors, but stewards. Somewhere right now, in the Balkans or the South Pacific, a leaf is filling with metal. It doesn't know it's part of a grand experiment. It's just doing what its ancestors taught it, reaching for the sun, drawing from the soil, and tucking a little nickel into its veins. We don't have to understand every part of the process to appreciate it, but the more we look, the more these plants teach us, not just about extraction, but about restraint, about the possibility of getting what we need from the earth without carving her open. So the next time you hold something metal, picture a field of wind-blown flowers, and remember there's more than one way to mine. There is a kind of beauty in camouflage, not the hide-and-seek kind used by insects or snow leopards, but a stranger, more elemental version, leaves glinting with a mineral sheen, as if dipped in chromium or brushed with graphite. These aren't tricks of light or tricks of the eye, they're the literal expression of what lies within. For some hyperaccumulator plants, their leaves shimmer with the very metals they've drawn from the soil, an armor that is both defense and declaration. The term for this is elemental defense. It means exactly what it sounds like, using elements, not proteins, not thorns, not bitter alkaloids, to deter the ever-hungry mouths of herbivores and insects. In some cases, it's like licking a spoonful of battery shavings. In others, it's closer to eating foil. Let's walk for a moment among the nickel-laden shrubs of Sabah on the island of Borneo. There's a tree here called Philanthus bulgui, a tall and elegant species discovered to accumulate up to 3% nickel in its leaves. That's not just defensive, it's declarative. You could practically polish the leaves and make them into a coin purse. One study led by Van der Ent and Baker tested the deterrent effect of such leaves on generalist herbivores. They offered insects a choice: ordinary leaves or hyperaccumulator leaves dusted with nickel. The insects, when given the option, opted out. Many refused to feed at all. Some nibbled cautiously, only to retreat, no doubt puzzled by the metallic mouthfeel. A few, brave or desperate, tried to adjust, but for the most part, they walked away. This isn't just theoretical. In nature, hyperaccumulators tend to suffer less insect damage than their neighbors. And it's not only insects. Fungi, bacteria, and even grazing mammals appear deterred by metal-heavy tissues. It's a form of passive aggression at the molecular scale. No need to swing a branch, just quietly raise your metal content and wait for your enemies to blink. In a particularly elegant study out of the University of California, researchers grew Streptanthus polygaloides, a California native known for nickel accumulation, in two soil types. One rich in nickel, one without. The nickel-fed plants had shinier, tougher leaves. They also suffered less herbivore damage. The results were clear: more metal, fewer bite marks. But how do these leaves come to glimmer in the first place? The surface of a leaf is a marvel of microscopic architecture. Waxy cuticles, stomatal pores, and thin transparent layers of epidermal cells all shape how light reflects. When those cells are saturated with metals, especially metals bound in chelate complexes, or sequestered within vacuoles, they change the way the leaf interacts with sunlight. The shimmer is not a trick, it is chemistry worn proudly. Sometimes the colors shift entirely. There are documented cases of cobalt and copper hyperaccumulators, whose leaves take on bluish or purplish tints, far from the usual green of chlorophyll. In one French nickel hyperaccumulator, Gysaurus pruinosa, the leaves bear a subtle silver blush, as if each one had been dusted with powdered moonlight. It's tempting to think of this as vanity, but for the plant, it's simply consequence. The color, the sheen, the armor, all follow from a single choice to live in metal. And that choice, over evolutionary time, has transformed not just their internal physiology, but their appearance and ecological role. In environments where most plants must wage chemical war with insects, producing bitter toxins, complex enzymes, or even calling in predatory wasps, hyperaccumulators take a shortcut. Why manufacture complexity when you can simply store nickel? There's efficiency here, but also cost. Maintaining high levels of metal in leaves can interfere with photosynthesis. It affects stomatal conductance, water regulation, and the fine-tuned dance of nutrient uptake. Some hyperaccumulators compensate by altering leaf thickness. Others reduce their growth rate to match their detoxification pace. And some seem to simply accept the trade-off. Better to grow slowly and be uneaten than grow quickly and be devoured. Not every predator is deterred. Of course, certain insects have adapted. A few species of leaf-mining moths, for instance, appear able to tolerate low levels of nickel, burrowing into hyperaccumulator leaves and completing their life cycle unbothered. But these are exceptions. For most would-be diners, metal is a hard no. The ecological implications ripple outward. In hyperaccumulator-dense areas, the usual food web is rearranged. Insects avoid certain plants. Herbivores browse selectively. Microbial decomposers, who often break down leaf litter and recycle nutrients, struggle to digest metal-rich detritus. The soil becomes stratified, not just by pH or moisture, but by taste. And above it all, the leaves glint. Not always, not obviously, but catch them at the right angle, under the right light, and you'll see the truth written in shimmer. This plant does not play. What's remarkable is that elemental defense doesn't require a central nervous system or even a memory. It's encoded, a long-term, low-energy, high-payoff strategy. And it works. I once held a leaf of Alyssum corsicum in my palm. It looked unassuming, no brighter than a common weed. But under a hand lens, I could see it. The faint crystalline sheen, like frost caught in the act of melting. I didn't lick it, though some bold researchers have, with caution and a lab nearby. The leaf felt stiff, not like leather, not like paper, something in between. A texture born of metal and sunlight. This is the alchemy of defense, the quiet decision to wear your enemy's weapon as armor, to drink the poison and hang its gleam from every limb. And in that gleam, a message: you may touch me, but you will not like the taste. Beneath every hyperaccumulator plant, far below the glittering leaves and the wary insects, lies a network as intricate as any city, a microscopic community built among roots, wrapped in soil, pulsing quietly with purpose. The root microbiome. Not a place, exactly, but a partnership. And if you want to understand how these plants manage to drink metals without dying of thirst, you'll need to dig into the dirt. Root microbiomes are living mosaics of bacteria, fungi, archaea, and more, each species exchanging nutrients, signals, and secrets with its host plant. For most plants, these microbial companions assist with basic chores: nitrogen fixation, phosphorus solubilization, warding off soil pathogens. But in the hyperaccumulator world, the game is a little more metallic. Let's imagine a nickel-rich hillside in Saba or a serpentine outcrop in southern Europe. The soil here is not friendly. It's dry, acidic, and glinting with metals most organisms would rather avoid, and yet certain bacteria thrive. They've evolved not only to tolerate nickel and cobalt, but to manipulate them, changing their chemical forms, making them more bioavailable to the plants they've grown up with. Some of these microbes act as middlemen. They help solubilize metals, transforming them from stable, inert particles into soluble ions that plants can actually absorb. Others bind metals to organic molecules, essentially pre-packaging them for safe delivery. In either case, they're not just surviving alongside the plants, they're actively helping them feast. One group of bacteria, known as pseudomonads, have been found in unusually high numbers around the roots of hyperaccumulators. In one study of Alyssum murae in Albania, scientists discovered that inoculating soil with nickel-tolerant pseudomonas strains increased the plant's metal uptake by nearly 30%. That's not a small effect. It's like giving the roots an extra set of hands. And then there are the fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are old, ancient allies of plants. They stretch their hyphae out like threads, extending the root's reach 1,000-fold. In return for sugars from the plant, they deliver water and nutrients, especially phosphorus. But in ultramafic soils, certain fungal species go further. They help sequester heavy metals in their hyphae, detoxifying the surrounding soil. Some even form dense mats around roots, acting as filters. Researchers at the University of Montpellier found that certain ectomycorrhizal fungi associated with nigh-accumulating Sabertia trees in New Caledonia could tolerate levels of nickel that would kill most fungal cells outright. These are not ordinary organisms. They're extreme specialists, operating at the razor's edge of biology and geology. But the relationship is not always cozy. In some cases, metal-tolerant microbes may actually compete with their host for control over metal ions. They may bind nickel too tightly, hoarding it in biofilms, or storing it in protective vesicles, keeping it from entering the plant's vascular system. Like all partnerships, this one is full of negotiation, sometimes generous, sometimes a little greedy. Still, the pattern holds. Hyperaccumulators do not work alone. Their success, their very survival, depends not just on genes or grit, but on the microscopic alliances forged underground. It's tempting to imagine each plant as a lone warrior, fending off predators with metallic grace. But in reality, each root tip is a marketplace. Each rhizosphere is alive with trade, metals for sugars, enzymes for signals, toxins for tolerance, and as conditions shift, rainfall, pH, microbial mood, the terms of that trade change. In fact, some researchers are now looking at engineered microbiomes as a way to enhance phytomining. If we can identify the microbial strains that most effectively boost metal uptake and pair them with the right plant species, we could design soil-plant systems optimized for both yield and resilience. Think of it like pairing a fine wine with the perfect cheese, only here, the wine is a nickel-rich plant, and the cheese is a bacterium that thinks in ions. It's also worth noting that these microbes may carry their own resistance genes, genetic blueprints, that allow them to survive high-metal environments. These genes can be passed along, sometimes even across species, adding to the genetic plasticity of the rhizosphere. It's a kind of underground arms race, not of weapons, but of adaptations. And it's ancient. Fossil evidence suggests that plants and microbes have been working together for at least 400 million years. Hyperaccumulators are just the latest twist in that long coevolutionary story. A story in which roots are never really alone, and soil is never just dirt. I once watched a root under the microscope, a delicate filament, branching out like a pale tree in a black sea. Around it, microbial cells darted and glimmered, forming colonies, forming stories. It reminded me less of a battlefield, and more of a coral reef, dense, crowded, beautiful, every inch alive with purpose. So next time you admire the silvery leaves of a nickel tree, or a cobalt-loving shrub, spare a thought for what's beneath. The real magic isn't just in the leaves. It's in the living scaffold of roots and microbes, quietly shaping how metal moves from stone to stem. We look up at forests, but sometimes the best part of the story is in the soil. There's a kind of hope that blooms not in flower beds or greenhouses, but in forgotten corners, old rail yards, shuttered factories, fallow fields where the soil itself seems to ache. Lead, arsenic, cadmium, elements that cling like ghosts long after the chimneys have gone cold. Places like these are not easy to rehabilitate. You can fence them off, post signs, build over them, but the toxins remain, invisible and tenacious, years after the damage was done. And yet, in some of these places, something quietly remarkable is happening. Fields of Indian mustard are growing, not as crops for oil or food, but as botanical janitors. Yellow-flowered, brisk-growing, deceptively cheerful, Brassica junca is one of phytoremediation's workhorses. It has a talent for drawing lead from the soil, taking the heavy metal in through its roots and storing it, mostly, in its shoots and leaves. This practice, known as phytoremediation, is not new in concept, but only in recent decades has it begun to show real-world results at scale. It's different from phytomining, which harvests metals for use. Here the goal isn't recovery, but removal, using plants to cleanse soil of its toxic burdens. In parts of the United States, particularly along the lead-contaminated zones of former industrial cities, researchers have conducted field trials with Indian mustard. One notable study, led by Rufus Cheney and colleagues at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, demonstrated that Brassica junca could reduce lead concentrations in soil by as much as 50% over multiple planting cycles. The plant does this without any genetic modification. It's just naturally good at handling lead. Its root system is broad and fibrous, excellent at scouring the upper layers of soil, where contamination tends to pool. It's also fast-growing and hardy, thriving in poor conditions where few other crops would bother. But even the best of plants need a little help. In many cases, chelating agents like EDTA are added to the soil to make the lead more soluble, easier for the roots to absorb. This comes with trade-offs. EDTA, if not properly managed, can leach into water systems, so newer approaches use more biodegradable compounds, citric acid, for instance, or rely on slow-breeding microbial partners that make lead more bioavailable in place. Elsewhere, in regions of India affected by tannery pollution and industrial waste, similar trials have taken root. Indian mustard is a familiar crop, widely cultivated for its oil, so it requires no elaborate farming infrastructure. Yet in these trials, it is not grown for consumption. After each harvest, the contaminated biomass is safely collected and incinerated, its ash disposed of as hazardous material. It's not glamorous work. There's no parade for a field of mustard quietly pulling toxins from the soil, but the results are real. In some villages, fields that once lay fallow due to pollution are slowly returning to agricultural use. Not overnight, not entirely, but steadily, like ink fading from paper. Other plants have joined the cleanup crew. Sunflowers, for example, have been shown to absorb uranium and cesium, especially relevant near former nuclear test sites. Willow trees, with their fast growth and deep roots, can draw heavy metals from wet soils. Even certain grasses, barely distinguishable from roadside weeds, have shown promise in absorbing chromium and arsenic. But Indian mustard remains a favorite, a sort of golden retriever of phytoremediation, loyal, effective and reliably cheerful. There's something beautiful about that. About the idea that a problem created by machines might be solved, slowly and gently, by leaves. That where once there was only contamination and despair, there might one day be greenery, not as decoration, but as medicine. It also changes how we think about waste. If soil can be healed by plants, perhaps contamination is not always permanent. Perhaps it's something that can be diluted, contained, reversed, not by force, but by patience, by seasons. Of course, this work is not without its limits. Plants can only access metals in the root zone. Deep contamination, several feet below the surface, often requires excavation or other remediation techniques, and the process takes time. One cycle might reduce metal content modestly. Several are needed for meaningful change, but time, when given, is one thing plants know how to use well. I visited one of these mustard fields once, just outside an old battery plant in the Midwest. The air was still, the soil dark, the plants moved softly in the breeze, their leaves rustling in a kind of constant low dialogue. No one who passed by would guess they were busy at work, undoing a century's worth of pollution, and that perhaps is the quiet genius of phytoremediation. It doesn't declare its success, it doesn't level hills or erect towers, it simply grows, and absorbs, and grows again. You might think of it as ecological acupuncture, small, precise, recurring treatments, gently nudging the land back toward health. And perhaps, if you look closely enough, you'll start to see these fields not just as plants, but as acts of forgiveness, not forgetting the damage, but meeting it, leaf by leaf. Stand close to a hyperaccumulator, and you might not notice anything odd. It could look like any other plant, leafy, green, gently photosynthesizing beneath the sun. But look again, its leaves are smaller, its growth slower, the edges of its foliage may curl inward slightly, thickened to resist water loss. There's a stillness about it that's not sleepy but deliberate, as though the plant has made a difficult choice and is now living with it. Because when a plant chooses to wear metal, it also chooses what it must give up. This is the trade-off at the heart of hyperaccumulation, a toxic talent purchased at the cost of growth, reproduction, and metabolic ease. While ordinary plants chase the sky, growing tall and fast and flower-rich, hyperaccumulators work more cautiously. They carry an invisible burden. Every molecule of nickel, cobalt, or zinc inside them must be carefully escorted, sequestered, and defended against. They are plants in armor, and armor is never light. Take Alyssum marale, one of the Balkan wildflowers we've already met. It is no stranger to hardship, growing on serpentine soils where calcium is scarce and magnesium is high, where the balance of micronutrients could topple any inexperienced root. This plant does not grow tall, its flowers are modest, but its tissues bristle with nickel, up to 2.3% by dry weight, an astonishing figure, and for that feat, it grows slowly, conservatively, as if aware that a single misstep in chemistry could spell disaster. It's not just about speed. High metal content interferes with the very mechanisms of plant development. Heavy metals, like nickel, can displace essential ions, such as iron and calcium, interfering with enzyme activity and protein folding. Even when sequestered in vacuoles or bound with organic ligands, the metal must be monitored, managed, and safely escorted throughout the plant's internal systems. This takes energy, lots of it, and energy spent on defense is energy not spent on growth or reproduction. Many hyperaccumulators produce fewer seeds. Some flower only briefly or infrequently. Others invest more in root systems than in canopy, anchoring themselves tightly to difficult soils, but missing out on competitive height. In an ordinary field, these plants might be outcompeted, overtaken by taller, faster-growing species that don't have to budget for detox. But on ultramafic soils, the equation flips. There, hyperaccumulators reign, not because they're the fastest, but because they're the only ones who can stay standing. It's a fascinating ecological inversion. In fertile soil, a slow-growing metal-heavy plant would be pushed aside. But in serpentine zones, its toxic talent becomes its ticket to dominance. Ecologists have modeled these dynamics. One such study, published in New Phytologist, compared the competitive fitness of nickel hyperaccumulating and non-accumulating species across different soil types. On ordinary soils, the hyperaccumulators suffered; on metal-rich soils, they thrived. The very trait that hobbles them in one environment becomes a superpower in another, but even within their niche, hyperaccumulators must walk a narrow path. Too little metal uptake, and they lose their defense advantage. Too much, and even their carefully honed systems can be overwhelmed. Some species exhibit what's called a threshold effect, benefiting from high metal content up to a point, after which additional accumulation begins to reduce fitness. The plant is always balancing, always measuring, and not all hyperaccumulators are equally compromised. Some have evolved secondary adaptations to mitigate the trade-offs. Nocaea rulescens, a zinc-accumulating species found in Central Europe, has developed highly efficient metal compartmentalization strategies that allow it to maintain relatively high growth rates even under stress. But these are exceptions, not the rule, and the trade-offs ripple outward. Slow-growing plants mean slower succession in disturbed ecosystems. Reduced seed output can limit genetic diversity, and while high metal leaves deter herbivores, they may also alter decomposition rates, affecting soil nutrient cycling and microbial community structure. The metal lingers, even in death. There's a kind of tragedy to it. These plants have mastered the art of surviving in poison, but in doing so, they've had to give up so much of what we typically associate with plant success: lushness, speed, abundance. Yet what they offer in return is no small gift. They stabilize fragile soils, they form the base of unique ecological communities, they tell geologists where the metal lies, and they teach scientists how to detoxify and recycle. Their sacrifice, if we can call it that, is not for nothing. I once walked through a serpentine glade in central Oregon, where Streptanthus species poke their purple heads up between dusty rocks. It's not a dramatic landscape. There are no towering trees or flowering carpets. Just a sparse whispering resilience. Every plant that grows there has chosen the hard path, and somehow that makes them seem older, wiser, more knowing. We tend to admire the fast and the tall, but maybe it's time we paid more attention to the slow, the armored, the stubborn. Plants that grow not in spite of hardship, but through it, not rushing upward, but enduring. After all, the strongest branches don't always reach the sky. Sometimes they just manage to hold their shape through the storm. From high above, the earth doesn't look like soil and stone. It looks like color. Swirls of rust red and mossy green, river threads, etched in silver, squares of cultivation, circles of desert bloom. Satellites, peering down from their quiet orbits, do not see trees or shrubs the way we do. They see reflectance values, how different wavelengths of light bounce off the surface. To them, a forest is a graph, a nickel field is a shimmer in a spectrum, and lately that shimmer has begun to tell us something new. Scientists have discovered that hyperaccumulators, because of their unusual leaf chemistry, can be spotted from space. Their metal-rich tissues reflect light differently, sometimes subtly, sometimes strikingly. This opens the door to a kind of planetary-scale botanical treasure hunt. Using satellite imagery and hyperspectral data, researchers are beginning to map out hidden reserves of metallophytes across the globe. It starts with spectroscopy, the study of how light interacts with matter. Every material has its own signature. Chlorophyll, for example, absorbs strongly in the red and blue parts of the visible spectrum and reflects green. That's why leaves appear green to us. But introduce high concentrations of nickel or zinc into those leaves, and the signature shifts. The change may be invisible to the naked eye, but to a hyperspectral sensor, an instrument that captures data across hundreds of narrow spectral bands, it's a flashing beacon. Fieldwork and spaceflight, hand in hand. In Borneo, teams led by Anthony van der Ent have been testing this method. They walk through nickel-rich forest patches with portable spectrometers, measuring how each plant reflects light. Then they compare those readings with satellite data. If a species with known hyperaccumulating traits shows a distinctive spectral pattern, the researchers search for that same pattern in satellite images elsewhere, sometimes revealing entire populations previously unknown to science. This isn't just academic. These discoveries help guide conservation efforts, especially in areas threatened by mining or land development. Many hyperaccumulators live in biodiversity hotspots, places with high species richness and high risk of habitat loss. Knowing where they are is the first step toward protecting them, but the implications go beyond preservation. This is also a tool for locating potential phytomining sites. If you can scan large areas and identify places where nickel-loving plants are already thriving, you can target ground-level surveys more efficiently. The process becomes faster, cheaper, and less invasive. The European Space Agency has supported research into this approach, and so have institutions in Australia and Southeast Asia. Data from satellites like Sentinel-2, Landsat-8, and even commercial platforms like PlanetScope are now being fed into machine learning models, algorithms trained to recognize the spectral fingerprints of hyperaccumulators. It's a strange synergy. Metal-hungry plants, which once existed only in botanical footnotes, are now being hunted with the help of artificial intelligence and orbital sensors. A plant tucked away on a misty ridge in Papua New Guinea might catch the attention of a researcher sitting in a lab in Switzerland, all because its leaves bounce light just a little differently. The technology is still evolving. Clouds, topography, and mixed vegetation make interpretation tricky. Not every spectral anomaly turns out to be a hyperaccumulator. And even when a likely candidate is found, field confirmation is essential. Someone still has to hike in, sample leaves, measure metal concentrations, and verify the find. But the promise is clear. It's a reversal of the usual order of things. For centuries, discovery happened from the ground up. A botanist wandered into the forest, pressed a leaf into a notebook, and only much later would anyone realize what had been found. Now we begin from above, and trace the clues downward. From sky to soil, there's something poetic about that. As if the planet is whispering its secrets in wavelengths we're only just learning to hear. This work has already borne fruit. In recent years, previously undocumented hyperaccumulator populations have been identified in parts of Southeast Asia, New Caledonia, and sub-Saharan Africa. Some are entirely new species, others are known plants, now reclassified thanks to their metal profiles. In each case, a new layer of complexity is added to our understanding of the Earth's botanical map, and it's not just nickel. Somewhere between the hope of green technology and the caution of ecological stewardship lies a question that rustles like dry leaves in the minds of scientists, conservationists, and community leaders alike. Should we mine the metallophytes? These rare plants, evolved over millennia to thrive in harsh, metal-laced soils, are now drawing attention not only from botanists and ecologists, but from mining companies and policymakers. The promise of phytomining, harvesting metals through plants rather than blasting through rock, is deeply compelling. It's clean, quiet, and aesthetically preferable to the moonscape scars of traditional extraction. But it comes with a tension that no amount of sustainability rhetoric can resolve. Many of these hyperaccumulators are rare. Some are endangered. Some live in ecosystems so delicate that a single bad decision could erase entire lineages. So how do we weigh the potential gains against the ethical costs? Take New Caledonia, where the soil is not just metal-rich but ecologically unique. The island hosts more than 400 endemic plant species that grow exclusively on ultramafic soils, many of them metallophytes. Conservationists have long regarded this biodiversity as both treasure and responsibility, and yet the nickel beneath the soil is valuable, strategically, economically, and technologically. As the demand for battery metals surges, pressure mounts to tap even marginal reserves. Phytomining on paper offers a compromise, but in practice the line between cultivation and exploitation can blur. Van der Ent, in his dual role as ecologist and phytomining advocate, has often emphasized the need for strict ethical guidelines. In his team's 2015 policy framework, he proposed that any phytomining effort must be preceded by rigorous ecological assessment. Does the target plant have a wide distribution, or is it locally endemic? Are there viable populations outside the proposed harvest zone? What are the potential impacts on pollinators, seed dispersers, and soil organisms? These aren't hypothetical concerns. In parts of the Philippines, rare nickel hyperaccumulators grow in patches no larger than a suburban garden. Even careful harvesting could disturb the root systems, affect seedling recruitment, or invite invasive species. And once the plant is gone, so too may vanish the only reliable indicator of that specific soil chemistry. The concern isn't limited to single species. These plants often act as cornerstones in their ecosystems. Remove them, and the entire web may fray. Their presence shapes microbial communities, nutrient cycling, even erosion patterns. They aren't just surviving in metal-rich environments, they're engineering them. And there's the cultural dimension. In some indigenous traditions, hyperaccumulators are considered sacred, symbols of endurance, guardians of the land. Using them for commercial gain without community consent is more than bad etiquette, it's a form of ecological theft. In light of these concerns, several researchers have proposed a sort of botanical zoning, delineating certain populations as conservation only, others as suitable for cultivation. In this model, seeds could be collected from protected populations and used to establish phytomining plots elsewhere, on degraded lands, abandoned mine sites, or areas where native vegetation has already been lost. This approach protects the wild lineage while still allowing the practice to grow. But even this model raises questions. Will cultivated lines maintain the same metal uptake efficiency? Will the microbial partnerships that aid accumulation follow them into new soils? Or are these plants so inextricably tied to place that transplantation will always come at a cost? There's also the slippery slope of economic interest. Once a species proves valuable, the market has a way of shifting priorities. Already some nurseries are advertising seeds of metallophytes, prompting concerns about unauthorized collection and biopiracy. Laws exist, but enforcement is patchy. A single field collected without permission can jeopardize years of careful conservation work. And yet the flip side must be acknowledged. If hyperaccumulators can offer a cleaner path to metals, one that avoids deep mining, chemical leaching and deforestation, then they deserve a seat at the sustainability table. They may be part of the solution, not just a curiosity on its fringes. The key, perhaps, lies in treating them not as crops, not as commodities, but as collaborators. Imagine a future in which phytomining plots are managed like vineyards, cultivated with care, informed by ecology, overseen by communities who share both the risks and the rewards, where research is open source, and benefits are shared, where metallophyte conservation and phytomining development are not in opposition, but in conversation. Already pilot projects are exploring this balance. In Sabah, Borneo, a partnership between local farmers, scientists and government agencies is testing small-scale phytomining plots grown from nursery-propagated seeds. The wild populations remain untouched. The work is slow and not yet profitable, but it respects the plants. Ethics in this context is not an obstacle to innovation. It is the soil in which responsible innovation grows, and perhaps that's the deeper lesson here, that even in the metallic corners of botany, where the stakes are high and the glint of utility shines bright, we are still guests. The plants were here first. We would do well to remember that. So should we mine the metallophytes? Only if we do so with humility, with consent, with the kind of respect that recognizes that not every green leaf is ours for the taking. Some are meant simply to shimmer. Not all wastelands are empty. Some are bristling with possibility, brown fields abandoned by industry, where the wind whispers through rusting fence lines and the ground is spiked with strange metals. These are the landscapes we've poisoned, paved over, left behind, and yet, even here, something might grow. Not redemption, perhaps, but recovery. One leaf at a time, enter the metal vacuum crops. The idea feels more like science fiction than agronomy, genetically engineered plants designed not to feed us, but to clean up after us. Imagine crops with root systems tuned to seek out lithium, or cobalt, or rare earth elements. Plants that can tolerate the harshest residues of our technologies, e-waste heaps, smelting scars, old battery dumps, and not just survive, but harvest what's left behind. This is the new frontier of phytotechnology, not just discovering what nature already does, but designing it to do more. Take Arabidopsis thaliana, the small mustard plant that has long served as the laboratory mouse of plant science. Researchers have used it to test transgenes from metal-tolerant species, inserting transporters and chelators from hyperaccumulators to increase its ability to draw in cadmium and lead. In 2019, a team at the University of California successfully expressed a gene from Nokia carulicens, a natural zinc accumulator, into Arabidopsis, resulting in significantly higher uptake of heavy metals. This kind of transfer isn't just theoretical. In pilot greenhouses, Modified plants have demonstrated the capacity to absorb double or even triple the metal content of their unmodified cousins, and with CRISPR gene editing, the process is becoming faster and more precise. It's not just about stuffing new genes into plants. It's about tuning an entire system: root exudates, transport proteins, vacuole storage, signaling pathways. Metal uptake is a complex choreography, and engineering it requires understanding every step. In some cases, the goal isn't just to detoxify soil, but to recover valuable metals from waste. That's where e-waste comes in. Electronic waste, old phones, computers, circuit boards, is the fastest growing waste stream on Earth. It's also astonishingly rich in metals. A metric ton of circuit boards can contain more gold than a metric ton of ore, but recycling it safely is a challenge. Toxic chemicals, illegal dumping and informal labor markets make the process dangerous and dirty. What if instead, we grew crops over shredded e-waste? It sounds improbable, but researchers are already experimenting with soil blends that incorporate pulverized e-waste, filtered of course, and test how plants respond. So far, a few hardy species have shown tolerance. None are ready for full-scale use, but the principle holds: where there's metal, there might be a root that wants it. Biotech companies have taken notice. Several startups now explore the development of metal harvesting plants, tailored to specific industrial sites. Some imagine subscription models: plant a crop, harvest it, extract the metal, repeat. Others are working on plants that could be deployed via seed bombs in hard-to-reach polluted areas. The idea is not just restoration, but gentle green extraction. Of course, with great possibility comes great responsibility. Engineered plants must be carefully monitored. There are risks: escape into wild populations, unintended interactions with local flora or fauna, disruption of microbial networks. Regulators in the United States, Europe and Asia have begun drafting guidelines, but the technology is running fast. And then there are questions of scale. Can metal vacuum crops realistically address the volume of e-waste we generate? Perhaps not alone, but as part of a larger layered solution, alongside improved recycling, better product design, and circular economy principles, they could play a vital role. They also invite us to reimagine what remediation looks like. Not just walls and warning signs, but rows of rust-tinted leaves. Not exclusion zones, but carefully tended plots that do what machines struggle to, selectively, silently, over time. Imagine a decommissioned power plant, surrounded not by barbed wire, but by engineered sunflowers, their roots seeking cadmium like buried treasure. Imagine former landfills sown with transgenic fescue, reclaiming arsenic and antimony one blade at a time. These aren't fantasies, they're field trials, slowly unfolding, and as they do, they ask us to think differently about design. What if our solutions weren't built out of steel and silicon, but out of cells and chloroplasts? What if we trusted plants not just to feed us, but to help fix what we've broken? There's a humility in that vision, a sense of continuity. We started by shaping plants for food, then for fiber, fuel, medicine. Now perhaps we shape them to help us remember the limits of what we've consumed. Not every metal-rich site will be healed by leaves. Some scars are too deep, some toxins too complex. But in the margins, those quiet, polluted edges of cities and supply chains, there may yet be life that leans toward restoration. It may not look heroic, a bit of green among the gray, but in those leaves, the shimmer of nickel, the glint of cobalt, the hint of a new chapter, a crop not for harvest, but for healing. The pace of plants is not our pace. They do not rush. They do not panic. A hyperaccumulator takes its time, drinking metal ions one by one, growing slowly, storing each bit of nickel or cobalt like a miser, tucking coins beneath floorboards. It is a patience we might envy, living as we do in a world that moves at algorithmic speed, sprinting toward progress, blinking past complexity. But in these metalliferous plants, there's a kind of quiet resistance, not to change itself, but to the speed at which we demand it. The planet is heating. Our technologies are multiplying. The metals needed for wind turbines, electric vehicles, solar panels, and smartphone batteries are piling up in demand, forecasts like storm clouds. We need nickel, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and we need them fast. But the plants? They are not fast. This is the tension. We face rapid problems, but our greenest solutions move slowly. Hyperaccumulators may extract metal from soil, may even help heal polluted land, but they do it over seasons, not fiscal quarters. And yet, perhaps that slowness is part of the wisdom they offer. Consider Philanthus rufus chani, the nickel-accumulating tree native to Sabah. It takes years to mature, to sink its roots into serpentine soil and start pulling metal from rock. But once established, it can be harvested sustainably, season after season, yielding kilogram after kilogram of nickel-rich biomass without disturbing the deeper strata. It is, in ecological terms, a long-game investor. Compare that to open-pit mining, a technique that rips through ecosystems in weeks, extracts metal, and leaves behind moonscapes that will not recover for centuries. The difference is not just speed, it is legacy. The slowness of hyperaccumulators forces us to reckon with time in a different way. What if a 10-year horizon is not a delay, but a rhythm? What if seasons of growth are not obstacles, but instructions? There is a concept in ecology called successional repair. It describes how damaged ecosystems recover, not all at once, but in stages. First the weeds, then the grasses, then shrubs, then trees, then the canopy. Each phase prepares the next. It is not linear, it is not efficient, but it works. Hyperaccumulators are often part of these early phases. Their tolerance for poor soils and metal-rich terrain makes them among the first to recolonize abandoned mines or eroded slopes. In doing so, they begin to rebuild the scaffolding for life. They don't just remove metal, they create the conditions for other species to return. And so, the plant that cleans the soil also hosts the insect. The insect attracts the bird drops seeds. The seeds become shade. This is what slowness looks like when you give it time. Researchers are beginning to incorporate hyperaccumulators into long-term land restoration projects. In Greece, field trials with Alyssum species are underway on degraded mining sites. In Australia, efforts are ongoing to rehabilitate ultramafic landscapes with a mix of native metallophytes and compatible microbes. These projects aren't fast, but their results endure. There's also a growing movement to design phytotechnology systems that blend species, fast-growing plants that stabilize soil quickly, paired with slower hyperaccumulators that remove metals over time. It's not about replacing one with the other, but harmonizing different tempos into a shared rhythm. In a way, it's like composing music. The percussion of grasses, the long notes of trees, the quiet pulse of microbes underneath. Together they form a song that the land remembers. But for such systems to succeed, we have to slow down our expectations. We must shift from extractive urgency to restorative patience, not just in science but in policy, in funding, in culture. This is hard. We are wired for now, for metrics, for quarterly returns and click-through rates. But ecosystems do not operate on quarterly logic. They operate on the logic of roots. The good news is, we've begun listening. There are climate models now that incorporate phytoremediation timelines, investment portfolios that include phytomining as a low-yield, long-term bet, urban planners who set aside land not for building, but for growing future soil. It's not a revolution, not yet, but it's a shift, a tremor in the tempo, because deep down, I think we understand that faster is not always better, that the fastest thing is often fire. But the truest things, forests, friendships, trust, grow slowly, and maybe the plants have known this all along. There is something deeply moving about a shrub that takes 10 years to pull nickel from rock and turn it into leaf. That survives because it chose to metabolize poison, and in doing so, made room for others. In this way, hyperaccumulators are not just tools, they are reminders that life doesn't need to be fast to be vital, that resilience doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just grows, steady, stubborn, leaf by leaf. The first time I saw a hyperaccumulator grove, it didn't look like much. A cluster of small, somewhat scrappy trees on a slope of rust-colored soil in southern New Caledonia. Their trunks were pale, their leaves a dull green edged with a faint silvery hue. They didn't sway dramatically. No birds sang from their branches, and yet the air around them felt occupied, as if something deep and ancient were at work just under the surface. I bent to pick up a fallen leaf. It crackled slightly in my hand, stiff, dry, brittle. I held it to the light. Nothing miraculous at first, but then, with the sun at the right angle, the metallic shimmer appeared. A quiet gleam, not the showy shine of foil or mirror, but something more restrained, like a whisper of nickel carried in every cell. These were trees that turned poison into poetry. They had no fruit to tempt, no flowers to impress, but they had survived on soil that would kill most plants. They had evolved to sip metals from the earth, store them safely in their stems, and carry them upward, one slow ring of growth at a time. And they had done it not as an act of resistance, but of transformation. What we call contamination, they call inheritance. And what a strange inheritance it is. Hyperaccumulators teach us that the boundary between toxin and tool is thinner than we imagine, that nature, when pressed, will find the most unexpected paths to persist, that even in the harshest places, in rock dust, in slag heaps, in forgotten quarries, there is potential waiting for the right leaf to unfurl. They also remind us that solutions don't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they show up in modest shoes, in a roadside weed, in a plant that no one thought to name for 50 years because it didn't look like much. But now we are learning to listen. Slowly, we are beginning to see that a leaf that glints like chrome might be more than ornamental, that roots which dive deep into poisoned soil might be carving the first tunnels of repair, that a field of mustard or a thicket of alyssum might be doing the hard, humble work of making the future possible. And that future, if we let it, could be built not just with rare earth elements and semiconductor breakthroughs, but with photosynthesis and stubbornness, with vines that climb over chain link fences and trees that hold nickel in their blood like a secret. The science is still unfolding, genes are still being mapped, partnerships between plants and microbes are still being teased out, satellite signatures still comb the canopy for the next glint of promise. But the heart of it, the lesson, is already here. That resilience is not an act, it is a process, and in the metallophyte groves of the world, in Borneo, in Greece, in New Caledonia, resilience is leaf-shaped. It is rooted in bad soil, swaying in toxic winds, flowering despite the odds. So if tonight or this afternoon, or whenever this story finds you, you feel a little worn out by the speed of things, you might take comfort in knowing that somewhere a tree is growing very slowly, very deliberately, turning metal into leaf, and leaf into light. Thank you for keeping me company through this quiet journey. You were never alone in the weeds. If you enjoyed this little journey into the secret life of hyperaccumulator plants, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Sleep well, fellow traveler. The roots are whispering, and you're always welcome here.